Thanks again, Mitt, for joining me. Appreciate it. I know this is a super busy time. Wanted to just like pick your brain on a few things going on in the space. And obviously know that you used to play college basketball. I used to play college baseball. Things have changed a lot since then. But one of the biggest things that I was curious to hear your take on was, I think it was 2 days ago, and I'm not sure if you know, Olivia Nuss. She's over at Student Athlete NIL. She posted earlier this week that I think it was Oregon passed a bill to amend the state NIL law protecting schools from penalties related to NIL violations by the NCAA or other governing bodies. The bill also allows NIL deals to be contingent on athletes attending a specific school, which is still currently against NCAA policy. So kind of just throwing it out there. Obviously, I'm not, by no means a lawyer. My background's more business focused, but looking to you for more of the legal interpretation of things there. In my mind, like this has to be one of the most pivotal things that has happened in the past 2.5 years. Obviously, a lot has happened. But from a legal perspective, to me, what this is saying is like the NCAA can still do its thing, right, and be a part of college athletics, but that will no longer entail telling athletes what they can and cannot do in a sense, or at least that's how I'm interpreting this. And further, it kind of told me that if athletes are going to be employees of anyone, in my mind, it wasn't going to be the NCAA based on this. So again, that's just my interpretation, but like, would love to get your thoughts on all of that and what you think was maybe the most important takeaway or two.
Yeah, I mean, with respect to that Oregon law, there are actually some other state laws that were passed last year that are very similar to the Oregon law in terms of they say universities in our state are allowed to do certain things that might not be allowed by NCAA rules, and NCAA, you cannot punish them or the athletes for doing those things. Some examples are Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, New York. Might be missing a couple. And then there are some other ones that are kind of going through the process right now that are similar to those laws in those states that already exist. And then the new Oregon one, South Carolina is an example. I think Mississippi's going to have one. Might be missing. Nebraska is another one. So, I mean, what it really tells me is that schools want to be able to do certain things that aren't currently allowed by NCAA rules. And instead of trying to go through the NCAA process of getting those rules changed, which takes forever, just because there's such a, number one, just the process itself is cumbersome. There's so many committees and it just takes a long time. But then number two, there's such a wide divergence of interests and financial resources among schools, even in Division I. And so those schools that are higher resourced, they want to be able to do certain things. But then you have other schools in Division I that maybe don't want to do those things and don't want to allow the other schools to do those things. So I think some of the schools are getting frustrated, and so they're going to state legislatures and trying to get some of these laws passed. And the legislatures so far have been pretty open to passing those laws because they want to do everything they can to ensure that the schools in their states are going to be competitive in recruiting. It just shows that there's also these institutions outside of the NCAA that are just continually chipping away at the authority the NCAA has, whether that's courts, which has been happening a lot. You saw in the Tennessee versus NCAA case that court enjoined their quote NIL recruiting rules. You had the case in West Virginia that enjoined their multi-time transfer rules, and then you have all the big antitrust cases from the past, O'Banner and Alston, and the current ones. You have House, Carter, Hubbard, and then you have all the NLRB stuff about the employees in the Johnson case. So there's just a lot of outside pressure bearing down on the NCAA, just chipping away at its authority, those cases. And then also now you have the state legislatures passing these laws that are doing that as well.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. Yeah, I would agree. Like over the past 2.5 years, it seems like the NCAA is just like slowly, not disintegrating, right? But like losing the ability to control different aspects of what's going on. And to me, it makes sense. And yeah, I mean, I have a couple other questions on that, but I'll get to this.
Yeah, on
So
that
I
same point,
guess,
one other thing on that point, like I think
yeah.
that's why you see the SEC and the Big Ten forming their joint advisory group. I
Mhm.
think, people have been trying to affect the needed changes to address the employment issue, the antitrust issues through the NCAA. And up until now, that's been a lot of lobbying, but there also
Yeah.
has been other stuff happening at the NCAA, like you saw Charlie Baker's Project D1 proposal that he threw out there. But again, going back to the divergence of interests at the NCAA and amongst the institutions, I think when you see the SEC and the Big Ten kind of forming their own group, they've gotten to the point where they're like, all right, we tried to do this through the NCAA, but we don't see a path forward through the NCAA. So we're going to create our own little group and figure out what the future of college athletics is going to look like.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's how, I mean, maybe it's separate from that specific case, but that's how I kind of see things playing out is right. Like there's going to have to be different tiers of how things are handled because obviously they're not all sports and not all levels of the sport are the same. So I think, yeah, more of that is going to have to be taken care of. And obviously it's going to be less of like a blanketed set of rules, maybe, which to me is how, the NCAA has kind of acted for decades. But no, that makes plenty of sense. Um, awesome. So yeah, no, my next question was like, what do you see as far as the path forward for college athletes and colleges when it comes to those non-revenue generating sports? And I'm mainly asking because, there's been a lot happening, but the biggest in my mind when it comes to this topic is LMU out in California cutting certain non-revenue generating sports teams. So wanted to just pick your brain on that too.
Yeah, I mean, you hear a lot of people say if we have to share revenue with, let's say, football players, then that money that we're currently using generated by the football team to fund some of our non-revenue sports won't exist, and then we're going to have to cut the non-revenue sports, which I don't necessarily believe to be true. I think if universities want to have these other sports and see value in having them, they'll have them. And the reason I believe that is if you look at Division II and Division III, those schools are not making money off of any of their athletics teams, especially at the Division III level, but they still have all the sports that lots of Division I schools have because they view it as important for the university, important for the students, important for attracting students to the university. So I think if you do have to take a good chunk of revenue that the football team generates or the basketball team generates that's currently being used to fund some of these other sports and transfer it over to payments to the athletes on those teams, schools are going to find other ways to financially
Yeah.
support these non-revenue teams as long as they see value in them. And I do, if what they say is true about how they value other sports, they're going to find other revenue to support those teams. Like people that are, in my mind, advocating for football, basketball, even other sports to get some of the revenue generated by those teams, they're not trying to eliminate these other sports.
Yeah.
They just want those athletes on those teams to be fairly compensated for the revenue that they're
Yeah.
generating. And they want those other sports to still stick around, and I think they will.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I mean, when it comes to like football, basketball, really any sports, like to me, again, like I'm biased probably as you might be, but having played, I don't really see much of a difference between, watching Caitlin Clark on the TV, right, versus any other professional athlete, especially now that they're not even considered amateur athletes. And that kind of gives me a good segue into my next question, which is given that these athletes are no longer technically considered amateurs, to me, it seems from a business perspective, it seems like the NCAA would be the equivalent of a nonprofit kind of umbrella entity or organization sitting over all of the professional sports teams, right? So if there's this nonprofit that made rules for the MLB and the NFL and the MLS, That's how I interpret it. But like, would you agree with that interpretation? Obviously, it's not the case, but how it is currently situated.
Yeah, I mean that's not a bad way to think about it. If it would be like if there's one broad organization and then you had all of the different professional leagues under that organization, and that broad organization is setting the rules for all of these different professional sports organizations. It's probably not the best setup. I mean, they're not set up that way. And if it did make sense for those professional leagues, they probably would be set up that way, but they're not.
Yeah.
So I think kind of what you're getting at is I agree that if there's more sport by sport organization and management, and whether that is somehow under the NCAA umbrella or if new college sports leagues are just completely formed by sport, I think that could make a lot of sense as well.
Yeah. No, that's one thing that I think might make honestly a lot of sense, especially when it comes to like, I think CBAs are going to be needed by sport. Like that's just how I'm thinking about it. But again, like who knows how it's going to play out.
Yeah,
And then kind of,
on that point, if we're in a world where college athletes are employees, maybe not all and not all levels, but some,
mhm,
and if they're going to collectively bargain with some entity, in my mind, it's going to make a lot more sense if you have like a new college football league and all
mhm,
the teams that are members of that new league. I know, let's say it's 40, 50, 60, whatever number is. All the players on those teams would have their own players association
yeah,
/ union. Then they could collectively bargain with this new college football league. Just, like the NFL players, the NFLPA bargains with the NFL, the NBPA, those players bargain with the NBA. Similar idea.
yeah. No, I mean, and kind of going off that, the way I think of all these leagues, not leagues, yeah, but all the sports in colleges, they're essentially an extension of all minor league systems and semi-professional sports teams that feed talent to the major leagues, in a sense. So I could definitely see that happening, and think it probably will at some point. But kind of going off that with the topic of employment, right? Like some say that athletes as employees will cost schools, let's just call it with 450 student athletes, about $9 million a year. Obviously, right? Like that's a lot of money. I'm not trying to get around that. But people are speaking about this as if it's, the most money a school or university has ever dealt with. Considering that the NCAA conferences, and the NCAA member schools didn't have to share a dime of these earnings from athletics and the streaming, rights that they earn off of, and all of those things for the past century, really, plus. Um, do you think that schools, often with endowments over, $1 billion at times, should have to afford this cost, or how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I mean, number one, I think there are plenty of schools that can afford it. It kind of goes back to that earlier point we were talking about. If schools want to continue operating their teams in a manner where the athletes on those teams will be deemed employees,
Mhm.
they're going to find the money to make that happen. I think the money at a lot of places already exists to make it happen, just through the athletics program. But if not, and they still want to operate in that manner, like you said, a lot of these universities are large universities, have lots of money. They're going to find a way to fund, whether that's some of their teams with an employee model, all of their
Yeah,
teams, whatever it is, they're going to find that money. And then we're talking about, there probably will be some universities that say, we don't want to operate our athletics teams or the entire athletics program in a way where our athletes are going to be deemed employees. In that case, you can change the way some of those teams are operated, or all of the teams are operated, to make sure they're not going to be deemed employees under the law. This isn't a
yeah,
thing where schools are just at the mercy of the NLRB or the courts or whoever ends up making that decision on employment. They can change the way they operate their
yeah,
teams to make sure the athletes are not considered employees. And for some
yeah,
schools, that might mean they need to reduce the amount of control exercised over the athletes. So schools will have options on how they want to move forward in a world, if and when college athletes are employees.
yeah. And I think that's like one point that kind of gets lost in the discussion around NIL, because I think a lot of people view it as, the schools have this view that they don't want to move forward the way things are playing out. And I don't know if that is the case. I appreciate you mentioning that. And I guess going off of that, if we do see that play out, right, and schools choose to pursue that model of employment, do you see what do you see happening first? Do you see student athletes becoming employees of their schools first, or their conferences, or potentially both?
Yeah, that's where it gets a little more tricky, because we
Yeah.
obviously have some schools are private and some are public. And if you're a private school, like we saw with Dartmouth, they're governed by the NLRB. So any private school could go through the same, or the athletes at private schools could go through the same process that the Dartmouth men's basketball team did with their unionization effort. But if you're an athlete at a public school, you're not governed by the NLRB, because public employers are governed by state law, state employment law, and labor law, as opposed to the NLRB, which is only governs private employers. So, and there are some states that don't allow public employees, which if you're an athlete at a public institution and you're considered an employee of that institution, you might not be able to unionize and collectively bargain based on what your state law is. So
Okay.
one solution to that is, yes, they could either all be employees of a conference, which are private entities, or one model that's been talked about by a number of people is, at least for teams that schools want to operate where the athletes are employees, they can spin off those teams into separate entities that are affiliated with the school or partially owned by the school. And then the athletes can be employees of those new private entities. So every team that's part of, if we go back to this new league structure, is governed by the NLRB, since they're all employed by private entities. And their universities have, affiliated entities like this already. A lot of them around like medical centers and things like that. So it's not some totally new structure that universities wouldn't have dealt with before.
Gotcha. And then last question here, because I know we're coming up on time. The way I see college athletics today is kind of, they serve as a marketing vehicle for the university. And so, you referenced it before, like Division III programs, for instance, aren't making these universities money, and that's fine. I don't think they necessarily need to, like you said. But I guess my question there is more so, do you see the possibility for, let's say, colleges to pursue a model where maybe the student athletes at those types of schools aren't employees, but rather, like marketing influencers, or, brand ambassadors of the school, or something of that nature?
Yeah, that's possible. If they operate those teams where they're not exercising the sufficient amount of control over the athletes to be deemed employees, then they could enter into, maybe independent contractor agreements to have the athletes perform some marketing services on behalf of the university, and whether that's through athletics programs or whatever it is. It's definitely a possibility, but the big factor is just going to come down to that issue of control over the athletes, which was, a big determining factor in the NLRB's decision related to the Dartmouth men's basketball team.
Got it.